The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were being brought to him that the manager was squandering his property. So the rich man summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do, now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, make it 50. Then he asked another, 'How much do you owe?' And he replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into their eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord.
It's an interesting phenomenon in today's readings, because it seems like the first reading and the gospel reading are basically contradicting each other. The first reading is from the prophet Amos. Amos was a prophet in the 8th century BC, and he's normally considered the first of the so-called classical prophets. And the classical prophets is a very important group. It includes people like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and some other lesser-known names. So, very important phase of the history of prophecy in Israel. And the thing that most distinguished the classical prophets of Israel, beginning with Amos, was that they were not trained in a school of prophecy. And prior to that, prophets almost went to something like a seminary. They were trained under prophets. And so, many of them were good people. Some of them were scoundrels. Many of them tried to, whether working at the royal palace, working in the shrines of Israel, or even in kind of private consultation, private practice, they tried to honestly tell the people what they thought God and the scriptures would want them to hear. And others said, well, what do they want to hear? Because if I tell the people what they want to hear, then they're going to look after me better. But the classical prophets who began with Amos, these were people not trained to be prophets, but called to be prophets, often almost kicking and screaming into it against their will. But in the end, they acknowledged that that's what God wanted from them, and that's what they gave to God. And so Amos gives us a very practical message here, yet one that seems to be contradicted by the words of Jesus in the gospel. He's speaking to the wealthy. Listen to this: if you're trampling on the needy, and if you're bringing ruin to the poor of the land, if you're saying, let's get these religious feasts over so we can open up our shops again and get back to business, or let's get the Sabbath over so that we can start selling things again. If you're saying, well, I'll put my finger on the scale, so I'm not really giving full value for what people are purchasing, or buying up the poor, taking them when they owe money and just for as little as a pair of sandals, enslaving the poor of Israel, even selling the sweepings of the wheat. When the wheat was harvested, they weren't supposed to try to get every little grain. Moses said, leave that for the poor. Let them come by afterwards so that they'll have something to eat. And what's the prophetic word that Amos gives? To those who are doing these things, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. And so on the one hand, Amos is telling people to be honest. And then in the gospel, we have Jesus giving this parable. A rich man who's about to be put out of office because he's been squandering the property of his master. And before he gives an accounting, he calls in those who owe things to his master. What do you owe? Okay, write down a smaller amount. What do you owe? No, put down a smaller amount. Well, when he's out of office, they'll say, well, he was good to me before he got fired, and hopefully they'll be good to him. The interesting thing, though, is it makes more sense when we realize how things worked in Jesus' time and in Jesus' world. Typically, one who owned a lot of property did not look after it himself, but he would hire someone to do that on his behalf. And many times would say, this is what I want to get from my property. Well, he would sort of look aside, and as long as he got that, he would be happy. Well, the one who was managing the property would then say to those who might have actually been farming it, he'd be thinking in his head, I need to get 50 bushels of wheat from this person. I want 100 bushels from that piece of property. 50 would go to the master. 50 would come to the one who was managing the properties. And this was known to be happening. And the masters didn't really care as long as they got what they wanted out of their property. Oil, wheat, whatever the case may have been, grain. They didn't care about that. In fact, they were quite happy to see their managers doing well themselves as long as they did even better. And so what Jesus seems to be saying is, in this parable, when this person who's obviously been dishonest somehow, and the master has found out, before he gives his account, he's kind of making things right. Not cheating the master further, which would be a recipe for absolute disaster, but he's making things right. If you only had to give 50, then just give 50. If you only had to give 20 barrels of oil, then just give 20. And he's hoping on the one hand, the master will see him being honest and looking after the master's business. And on the other hand, if he's actually fired, that those who were kind of under him, who were actually doing the work, will think more highly of him and perhaps will help him to find another place. So ultimately, I don't really think that the gospel and Jesus is contradicting the words of the prophet Amos and basically the message of the scriptures. Be honest and decent in your dealings with others. But it takes us kind of having more of an understanding of how things worked in the time of Jesus to fully be able to understand that it's not contradictory as it first seems to be.